We can all struggle at times to someone if what they say arouses painful emotions in us. We don't want to hear it. They might be trying to tell us something about ourselves that we find difficult to hear. The very human tendency is reflected in the disciples in today's gospel. Jesus is telling them something very important about what was about to happen to him. In the words of the gospel, he was telling them that he would find himself in the hands of others who would put him to death. This was something that the disciples found very hard to hear and were not able to take it on board. As the gospel says, they did not understand what he said, and they were afraid to ask him. Already in Mark's gospel, Jesus told them what was likely to happen to him. They were no more open to hearing in the second time that they were as they did in the first time he told them what was going to happen. They did not understand it, and they were reluctant to question him because they were afraid they might not be able to live with the answer he would give them. In some ways, that is a very human reaction. We often find ourselves not willing to ask questions because we suspect that we would struggle to live with the answers. Yet in our heart of hearts, we often recognize that there are certain realities we have to face, even if they are painful to face. There are certain illusions we might have to let go of, even if we have come to cherish them. In the second part of today's readings, the gospel, Jesus worked to disillusion his disciples in the good sense. He needed to pry from them away from the illusions of greatness that they harbored. They seemed to have thought of being part of Jesus' circle would bring them privileges and status. No sooner had Jesus spoken of himself as someone who would end up as one of the least, then the disciples began to argue among themselves as to which of them was the greatest. They wanted power, and it seems as though they wanted power for its own sake. This is a kind of self-centered ambition that James talks about in the second reading when he says, you have an ambition that you cannot satisfy, so you fight to get your way by force. In place of that very worldly ambition, Jesus places in the midst of his disciples a small child. The wisdom that came down from above, Jesus speaks of. This is the God's ambition for their lives and for all our lives. It is the ambition to serve, as Jesus says in the gospel. Those who want to be first must be the servants of all. This ambition to serve, again in the words of James in that second reading, is something that makes of peace and kindly and considerate. It is full of compassion and shows itself by doing good. Jesus implies that this should be our priority, our primary ambition as as follows: to be servants of each other. All our other ambitions have to be subservient to that God-inspired ambition. In his teaching to the disciples and all of us, Jesus is careful on his teaching by performing a very significant action. He takes a little child and sets the child in front of the disciples, putting his arms around the child, and declares that whoever welcomes such a child welcomes him, and not only him, but the God who sent him. He was saying that by action, that the ambition to serve must give priority to the most vulnerable members of our society, symbolized by a child who is completely dependent upon adults for his or her well-being. Our ambition is to serve those and serve one another, not only to serve them, but to serve Jesus by serving them. Jesus assures his disciples and us that in serving the most vulnerable, we are in fact serving him. In the presence of the disciples who seemed consumed with an ambition for power, Jesus identifies himself with the powerless, those who are most dependent on our care. Over and against the ambition of the disciples to serve themselves, Jesus puts the ambition to serve him as he comes to us and through the weakest members of our society. In our gospel, Jesus is putting before us what his family of disciples, what the church is really all about. I compare our bulletin with many other bulletins from other parishes. Now, I don't want to just simply give a comparison to say we're better than them, but it is true. When you look at our bulletin, I give our bulletin out to people who don't even belong to the parish and say, here, look at a good parish. And if we want to serve others, look at our bulletin. There are plenty of opportunities to serve in the church and to serve in our community. We should be noted for our love. That was the early Christians. They will know us by our love. See how these people love one another. We have a long way to go, a long way to go. Especially when I consider today I'm going to have a baptism of a member of my family, but I'm not sure what I'm doing because I know their parents aren't going to church. So here's a person only baptized, simply baptized. I can't say that it's merely baptized. After all, in a baptism, you become a child of God with a destiny. And yet, how many children? I have a window that looks over the parking lot here, and I see people coming to church. I see a mother and her children. I say, where's the father? Or I see a father with the children. I say, where's the mother? And I pray for them as they come in here to worship, but I also pray for those they left behind, their family members who aren't here, who should be here, to worship our God. Jesus said, I am about to die for you. I'm the lamb meant for sacrifice, so that you may have life and have it to the full. Receive it. Receive that life. I was thinking about a funeral I have coming up, and I was thinking about being at the deathbed of a man. His last words to me were, it's a good story, isn't it? Yeah, it's a marvelous story, but do you believe in it? I couldn't ask him that because he had just died. It's a marvelous story, isn't it? And you are part of that story.